The night before his hanging arrived without mercy, settling over the town like a held breath, and Silas Merrick sat alone in the narrow cell beneath the gallows, listening to the wind as it threaded its way through the wooden beams above him, making the ropes creak and whisper as if already practicing his name, and in that sound, half sigh, half warning, he felt the weight of every road he had ever ridden, every choice he had ever made, pressing down on his chest until breathing itself felt like an act of defiance. The jailer had given him a single lantern and a tin cup of water, then locked the door without a word, for there was nothing left to say to a man whose story, as far as the town was concerned, had already ended. Yet Silas knew stories had a way of refusing to die, especially the ones soaked in blood and rumor, the ones told by men who had not been there and women who only remembered the fear. And as he leaned back against the cold stone wall, chains heavy around his ankles, he wondered if the wind would carry his words beyond these walls if he spoke them aloud, because there was a truth buried so deep inside him that it had shaped every step of his outlaw life, a truth no court had asked for and no witness had ever known. And tonight, with the rope waiting and dawn drawing closer with every heartbeat, that truth stirred like a restless ghost. Silas closed his eyes and began to speak, not loudly, not to any person, but to the night itself, confessing first the simple things, the dust of the long trails, the ache of hunger, the way a man's name could change depending on who was saying it, before moving deeper into the memory he had kept sealed since the day it happened, the day that turned him from a quiet ranch hand into a hunted legend, a day that the newspapers later twisted into something cruel and sharp, though none of them had ever known what he knew, or why his hands had shaken as he pulled the trigger that first time. He spoke of a small valley far from here, where the grass grew soft and the river ran gentle, where a woman named Eliza Hale had once laughed beside him in the shade of a cottonwood tree, her laughter light enough to make him believe, for a brief and foolish moment, that the world could be kind, and he confessed how he had loved her without knowing how to protect her, how the men who later wore badges had come not to bring justice but to take land, how they had pushed and threatened until something inside him finally broke, and how the shot that echoed through that valley had not been fired in anger but in terror, a desperate attempt to stop what could not be stopped, a sound that chased him across years and miles until it settled into his bones. The wind outside rose and fell as he spoke, rattling the gallows boards like an impatient listener, and Silas felt the strange comfort of being heard at last, even if only by the darkness, even if only by God, whom he had avoided for years out of shame. And as his confession deepened, he admitted to the choices that followed, the robberies staged not for greed but to fund escape, the lies told to keep Eliza hidden, the night spent watching the horizon for riders who would never stop coming, and he told the night how the legend of Silas Merrick had grown larger than the man himself, how people began to expect cruelty from him and how, over time, he learned to wear that expectation like armor, because it was easier to be feared than to be known, easier to let them believe he was heartless than to admit his heart had already been broken. He spoke of the faces that haunted his sleep, not just the dead, but the living too, the children who stared at him from doorways, the women who crossed the street when he rode into town, the men who challenged him simply to prove they could stand against a monster, and with each memory, his voice grew quieter, as if the confession itself was draining him, as if every word peeled away another layer of the legend, until only the tired man beneath remained. Somewhere above, the rope swayed, brushing softly against the beam, and Silas opened his eyes, staring at the small square of night visible through the cell window, wondering if Eliza was still alive, wondering if she had ever heard the stories told about him, wondering if she would recognize herself in them. And then he confessed the final secret, the one that had never passed his lips before, the one that would shatter the neat ending the town had prepared for him. For Silas Merrick was not the man who had planned the massacre that sealed his fate, nor the one who had ordered the fire that burned the homestead, nor the leader the newspapers claimed, but a shield raised too late, a scapegoat chosen because he was already marked. And as he admitted this, his voice cracked for the first time, because it meant acknowledging that he had accepted the role willingly, had stepped forward to take the blame so that another could disappear into a quieter life, because love, once, had demanded that price of him. The lantern flickered, shadows stretching and shrinking like uncertain memories, and Silas laughed softly at the irony of it all, that the truth came only when it no longer mattered, that justice arrived hand in hand with death. And yet, even as the confession reached its end, he felt a strange calm settle over him, as if speaking the truth had loosened the rope before it ever touched his neck. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the distant sounds of the sleeping town, unaware that the legend they would bury at dawn was whispering his humanity into the dark, and Silas Merrick rested his head against the wall, breathing slow and steady now, knowing that when the sun rose, the gallows would take his body but not his story, because stories had a way of slipping through cracks, riding the wind, and finding ears that were ready to listen, and somewhere beyond the reach of this cell, beyond the noose and the law and the blood-soaked myths of the Wild West, the truth was already moving, quiet and unstoppable. Like dawn itself, she arrived in Red Mesa at the hour when the sun bled low against the desert hills, turning the dusk gold and the shadows long, and though no one announced her name aloud, it moved through the town faster than the heat, whispered from porch to porch and saloon to stable like a warning that could not be taken back, for everyone knew the stories of Mara Calhoun, the widow whose past stretched across the west like a trail of broken gravestones, a woman said to carry death with her. The way other women carried perfume, subtle but unmistakable, and she rode alone, dressed in black not for show but because grief had long since chosen her colors, her face calm and distant beneath the wide brim of her hat, eyes that seemed to look beyond Red Mesa as if she had already decided she would never belong here. The men watched her with a mix of fear and longing, because beauty had a way of making fools even of cautious souls, and Mara was beautiful in a quiet, weathered way, like the desert itself, shaped by loss rather than softness, and they remembered the rumors well, that her first husband had been shot in a border skirmish, the second knifed in a saloon fight, the third hanged as an outlaw with her name on his lips, and so when she bought the small adobe house at the edge of town, close enough to hear the wind but far enough to be left alone, most believed she would bring nothing but sorrow to Red Mesa, just as she had everywhere else. Mara did not correct them, because the truth was heavier than rumor and not something she wished to set down among strangers, and she settled into her days quietly, drawing water at dawn, tending a small garden that struggled against the dry earth, speaking little but listening often, for she had learned that silence was safer than explanation, and at night she sat on her porch and watched the stars come alive, each one reminding her of a man she had loved and buried, each memory sharp and tender all at once, she told herself. She was done with love, that whatever curse followed her footsteps had already taken enough, and yet fate, stubborn and cruel, had not finished its work, because one evening, as a dust storm rolled in from the south and the sky darkened too early, she heard a sound at her door that was not the wind, not the shifting of sand, but the dull thud of a body giving into exhaustion, and when she opened the door, there he lay, collapsed across her threshold, blood soaking through his shirt, his revolver fallen from his hand as if even it had abandoned him, and for a long moment she simply stood there, heart pounding, because she knew what it meant when wounded men appeared in her life, knew how these stories always ended, yet she knelt anyway, because turning away would have been a kind of death too. His name, she learned later, was Thomas Reed, a gunslinger with more scars than years and eyes that held both defiance and regret, a man hunted not because he enjoyed violence but because violence had found him first, and as Mara dragged him inside, bolted the door, and worked through the night to clean his wound, she felt the old ache stirring in her chest, that dangerous pull toward another broken soul, and Thomas drifted in and out of fevered sleep, murmuring names she did not recognize, apologizing to ghosts she could not see, and in those moments Mara saw past the gunman the town would one day fear, glimpsing instead the boy he must have been before the world hardened him, and days passed with him hidden in her home, the town unaware or pretending to be, and during those days a fragile bond formed, built from shared silence and careful glances, from the way Thomas watched her as if she were something holy and doomed all at once, from the way Mara felt herself softening despite every warning carved into her past. They spoke in fragments at first, of the weather, of the land, of nothing that mattered, until one evening when Thomas asked her why she lived alone and she answered not with the stories but with the truth, telling him simply that love had always come at a terrible price, and he listened without judgment, because he understood prices better than most, and in his presence she felt something she had not felt in years, not hope exactly, but the quiet relief of being seen without being claimed, and yet the town began to notice, as towns always do, and whispers followed Thomas's slow recovery, and men started asking questions, their fear of Mara mixing with suspicion, because Red Mesa did not welcome trouble and Thomas Reed was trouble written plainly in the way he carried himself, and Mara sensed the tightening noose before it was visible, felt it in the way the sheriff lingered near her gate, in the way neighbors avoided her eyes, and one night, beneath a sky crowded with stars, Thomas stood on her porch, healed enough to ride, and told her he would leave before dawn, because staying would only bring blood to her door, and she did not argue, because she had learned the shape of these endings too well, but when he reached for her hand, the touch was gentle and devastating, and in that moment she understood the cruel joke fate was playing, offering her love only in passing, never in peace, Thomas kissed her forehead, a gesture more intimate than any promise, and whispered that meeting her had been the first kind thing the world had given him in a long while. And Mara watched him ride away at sunrise, dust rising behind him like a fading dream, telling herself she had survived worse, that her heart knew how to close itself again. But fate was not finished, because by midday the gunfire began, echoing from the outskirts of town, sharp and final, and the truth reached her before the bodies did, carried on the same whispers that had once warned Red Mesa of her arrival, for Thomas Reed had been ambushed by men who feared his past and blamed her name, and though he fought like a man who had nothing left to lose, he fell beneath the burning sun, miles from her door but never far from her heart, and Mara stood alone on her porch as the desert swallowed the sound of gunshots, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her face. Knowing that the legend would grow again, that Red Mesa would remember her not as the woman who tried to save a life but as the widow who left death in her wake, and yet, as the sun dipped low and the wind carried the scent of sage across the land, she felt something else beneath the grief, a quiet, defiant certainty that love, no matter how brief or tragic, was never a mistake. And though she would bury Thomas Reed without the town's blessing and mourn him without its sympathy, his memory would live where legends could not reach, in the silent spaces of her heart, where no rumor could ever touch it. And as night fell over Red Mesa, the widow remained, not cursed but enduring, carrying forward another story the West would never fully understand. Deadwood Crossing lay stretched beneath a hard, unforgiving sky, its buildings slumped and weary as if even the town itself had grown tired of surviving without law. And when the lone rider appeared on the horizon, most folks barely looked up, because hope had been beaten out of that place years ago. Yet the man on horseback carried something heavier than dust and fatigue, something that pulled eyes toward him despite themselves, for pinned beneath his coat was a tarnished marshal's badge, dulled by time and regret, and the man wearing it, Jonah Hale, had sworn long ago he would never let that piece of metal touch his chest again. Jonah rode slowly through the main street, boots creaking, shoulders stiff with old injuries and older memories, aware of the way doors closed and windows darkened as he passed, aware too of the quiet fear that clung to Deadwood Crossing like smoke, because the town belonged to the Black River Gang now, men who ruled with guns and cruelty in equal measure, men who laughed at badges and buried those foolish enough to wear them, and Jonah knew their laughter well, for it echoed in his dreams, carried on the faces of men he had failed to save the last time he tried to stand between order and chaos. He stopped his horse outside the abandoned marshal's office, its sign hanging crooked, paint long since peeled away, and as he dismounted, the ache in his leg flared, a reminder of the ambush that had ended his career years earlier, the ambush where he had trusted the wrong man, arrived too late, and watched a town burn while screams filled the air, a night that had cost him his badge, his confidence, and the woman he loved, who had looked at him afterward with eyes full of grief and disappointment and quietly packed her things before dawn. Jonah unlocked the office door with a key he carried more out of habit than hope, stepping inside to find dust thick on every surface, silence pressing in from all sides, and as he set his saddle down and removed his coat, he felt the weight of the badge against his chest, heavy as guilt, because he was not here chasing glory or redemption, not truly, but because running had finally grown harder than facing what he had lost, and because a letter had reached him weeks ago, written in a careful, desperate hand, telling him that Deadwood Crossing was on the brink of war, that the Black River Gang had turned neighbor against neighbor, and that if no one stood up soon, there would be nothing left to save. Word of his arrival spread slowly at first, then all at once, carried by cautious glances and half-open doors, and by afternoon a handful of townsfolk gathered outside the office, not with cheers but with wary hope, faces lined by hardship, eyes asking questions Jonah was not sure he could answer, and when an old shopkeeper finally spoke, his voice trembling, asking if Jonah Hale truly meant to stay, Jonah hesitated only a moment before nodding, because whatever doubts twisted inside him, leaving again would have been the final failure, and so he began the hard work of rebuilding law with almost nothing, posting notices no one read, fixing doors no one had used, listening to stories of stolen land, missing sons, and quiet threats whispered in the dark, and each story added another stone to the burden he carried, another reminder that his past failure was not unique but part of a larger pattern of good men arriving too late. The Black River Gang did not confront him at once, choosing instead to test him, to see if this broken marshal would bend, and Jonah endured their provocations with a grim patience, breaking up fights, confiscating guns, standing his ground even when his hands shook, and at night he sat alone in the office, cleaning his revolver, replaying the moment years ago when he had hesitated for just a second too long, when the ambush had sprung and his partner had fallen beside him, blood soaking into the dirt as Jonah screamed for help that never came, a memory that left him staring into the darkness until dawn. As days passed, the town began to change in small ways, cautious ways, children lingering a bit longer in the street, shopkeepers opening their doors wider, and Jonah felt a fragile sense of purpose taking root, though he knew it would not last without a reckoning, because men like the Black River Gang did not give up power willingly, and the reckoning came one evening when their leader, Cole Braddock, rode into town with half his men behind him, stopping in the center of the street beneath the setting sun, his smile sharp and knowing as he called Jonah out by name, mocking the badge, mocking the idea of law, reminding Jonah loudly of the town he had lost years ago, of the people who had died trusting him, and with every word, Jonah felt the old shame rise, threatening to choke him. Yet when he stepped out to face Braddock, he did so without drawing his gun, his voice steady as he told the gang that Deadwood Crossing would no longer belong to fear, that if blood must be spilled, it would not be without resistance, and the standoff that followed felt like the world holding its breath, townsfolk watching from shadows, knowing that this moment would decide everything. Braddock laughed and rode away, promising to return with fire, and that night Jonah gathered the townspeople, speaking honestly for the first time about his past failure, about the town he had lost and the mistakes that haunted him, and instead of turning away, the people listened, because they recognized truth when they heard it, and they chose to stand with him not because they believed he was flawless, but because he was willing to stand at all. The days that followed were tense and quiet, filled with preparation and fear, and when the Black River Gang returned at dawn, guns blazing, Deadwood Crossing answered not with chaos but with resolve, the townsfolk fighting alongside Jonah, protecting one another, and though the battle was brutal and the cost high, Jonah did not hesitate this time, did not look away or freeze when the moment demanded action, and when Cole Braddock fell in the dust, defeated not by rage but by Jonah's steady hand, something inside the marshal finally loosened, a knot pulled tight for years at last beginning to give. When the smoke cleared, Deadwood Crossing stood battered but alive, and Jonah sank onto the steps of the marshal's office, exhausted beyond words, watching the sun rise over a town that had chosen to believe again, and though the ghosts of his past still lingered, still whispered of what could never be undone, they no longer owned him entirely, because he had faced them and stood his ground. And as the people of Deadwood Crossing gathered around him, not cheering but offering quiet gratitude, Jonah Hale understood that wearing the badge had never been about erasing failure, but about carrying it forward and choosing, again and again, to do what was right despite the cost. And beneath the harsh western sky, the last marshal of Deadwood Crossing finally found a reason to stay. Black Canyon was a wound cut deep into the earth, a place the sun seemed to avoid and the wind never crossed without changing its voice, and everyone within 100 miles knew the stories well enough to steer clear of it. Stories whispered beside campfires and spoken only halfway, of a gold vein so rich it could buy kingdoms and so cursed it left no man alive to spend it, gold said to belong not to nature but to the devil himself, buried there after a forgotten war between greed and mercy. And Caleb Drummond had heard those stories all his life and laughed at them, because laughter was easier than hunger and disbelief cheaper than hope, and by the time the map found its way into his trembling hands, he was a man with nothing left to lose. The map had been pressed into his palm by a dying stranger in a roadside shack, ink faded, paper brittle, the stranger's eyes wild as he whispered that Black Canyon did not give, it only traded, and that every ounce of gold came at a cost the soul might not survive. But Caleb barely listened, because desperation has a way of dulling fear, and as he rode toward the canyon days later, dust rising behind him like the past he could not outrun, he told himself curses were just stories told by men who had failed where he would succeed. The land changed as he neared Black Canyon, growing quieter, heavier, as if sound itself feared to linger, and it was there, on the third night beneath a moon too pale to feel real, that Caleb first heard the whispers, soft at first, like wind slipping through cracks in stone, calling his name though no one else was there, promising relief from hunger, warmth instead of cold nights, a life where he would never have to beg or run again. And though his heart raced, a strange comfort settled over him, because the voices spoke with certainty, with the calm assurance of something ancient and patient, something that knew men well. As he entered the canyon, towering rock walls closed around him, blocking the sky, and shadows moved where none should, stretching and shrinking as if alive, and Caleb felt watched, measured, weighed, yet each time doubt crept in, the whispers returned, guiding him deeper, pointing him toward markings on stone that matched the map perfectly, and when he finally found the vein, gleaming faintly in the torchlight, like a vein of fire trapped in rock, his breath caught, because the gold was real, more real than anything he had ever known, thick and pure, enough to erase every failure that had shaped his life. He began to dig with shaking hands, each strike of his pick echoing too loudly, and with every chunk of stone he pulled free, the whispers grew clearer, warmer, praising his courage, his persistence, telling him he was chosen, that the canyon had waited for him. And in those moments Caleb forgot the dying man's warning, forgot the stories of bones found picked clean and camps abandoned mid-step, forgot the feeling of being watched, because greed, once awakened, speaks louder than fear. Days blurred together as he worked, hauling gold into sacks until their weight bent his back, and it was only when he tried to leave that the price revealed itself, because the canyon would not let him go so easily, the path he had taken in twisting impossibly, landmarks shifting, shadows falling wrong, and the whispers changing tone, no longer kind but demanding, reminding him that nothing taken here was free, and that he had been listening only to promises, not to the cost beneath them. Caleb's sleep grew restless, filled with dreams of men clawing at rock, of hands reaching from the canyon walls, of gold melting into blood, and when he woke, he found his supplies spoiled, his water gone, as if the land itself was stripping him down to what truly mattered, and in the silence that followed the whispers returned, clearer than ever, offering guidance again, but now with conditions, urging him to leave some of the gold behind, then more, then all, testing him, measuring how tightly he clung to what he believed would save him. He argued aloud with the empty air, cursing the canyon, swearing he had earned every ounce, and the canyon answered with a low rumble, rocks shifting, a warning felt more than heard, and in that moment Caleb understood too late that the curse was not a spell laid on gold but a mirror held up to the heart, revealing what a man valued when stripped of comfort and choice. As his strength faded and his steps grew unsteady, the whispers changed again, softer now, almost sorrowful, telling him of the others who had come before, men who had loved gold more than life, men who had chosen wealth over mercy, and Caleb saw them then, not as ghosts but as impressions in the stone, stories etched into the canyon walls, each one a warning ignored, and for the first time since finding the map, he felt something break inside him, not his body but his certainty, and he fell to his knees amid the scattered gold, realizing that even if he escaped, the man he would become carrying that wealth would not be the one he wanted to be. With trembling hands, he opened the sacks and let the gold spill back onto the canyon floor, the sound dull and heavy, and as the last piece fell, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant silence that felt like judgment and mercy intertwined, and the canyon shifted once more, revealing a clear path where none had been before. And Caleb staggered forward, leaving behind everything he had come for except his life. When he emerged days later into open desert, thin and broken but alive, the sun felt blinding, almost holy, and he wept then, not for the gold lost but for the man he might have become had the canyon not forced him to see himself clearly. And though he told his story only once, to a quiet town that listened with half belief and half fear, the legend of the Devil's Gold of Black Canyon grew richer for it. Because some swore they still heard whispers when the wind turned just right, not promising riches anymore but reminding those who listened that the West did not curse men for wanting more, only for valuing it above their own souls, and deep within Black Canyon, the gold remained, waiting patiently, not for the brave or the strong, but for the next desperate heart willing to learn the price.